here we are, finally ready for Chapter 1. If you haven't heard the prologue and the introduction, then you'll need to go back and check those out. Chapter 1, the 60s, El Paso, and the Neymans. The mid-1960s in the United States was a revolutionary time on many fronts. The Vietnam War inspired widespread dissolution of confidence in our leadership worldwide and major protests at home. The civil rights movement was in full throttle in the attempt to end discrimination against blacks. The women's liberation movement was gathering steam with the formation of the National Organization for Women, NOW, in 1966. In El Paso, the demand for civil rights among the Hispanic population marched right along with America's anti-war and civil rights demonstrations. All of these converging forces meant history was being made. While all this was going on, I was a kid growing up in El Paso, Texas. El Paso was and is a city with a history of its own. It's not the South, and it's not the West. Texas itself cannot possibly be summed up in a single stereotype. Texas is huge. As a child visiting my cousins in Brownsville down on the Gulf of Mexico in farthest South Texas, we'd spend the first couple days saying, "What? What did you say?" Even though we hailed from the same state and only 835 miles separated us, our accents were so different that we couldn't each understand each other until our ears could tune to the new sounds. El Paso is the farthest western city in Texas, located in the high desert on the Rio Grande River, across from Mexico to the south and New Mexico to the west. It was a city that had long been a melting pot of the cultures sharing the banks of the Rio Grande River with Juarez, Mexico. Mexican, Spaniard, cowboy, rancher, and the indigenous native tribes all coexisted, working together and in opposition to one another, while maintaining their own traditions in a city that has always taken great pride in itself, its people, and its history. You grow up loving spicy food and believing in the hybrid Catholic indigenous folklore taught on the front porches of your friends' homes. Toward the very end of the Mexican Revolution, El Paso was the audience to a scene across the border during the Battle of Juarez. On June 15, 1919, the rebels of Francisco Pancho Villa attempted to capture the city of Ciudad Juarez from the Mexican army and provoked the U.S. Army forces that were protecting El Paso. The house I grew up in, which was built in 1882 when the city's entire population was less than 10,000, was on a hill only 3 miles from the Rio Grande River and Ciudad Juarez. It had foot-thick adobe walls and a 4.5-foot-high rock wall around it. It was snugged right up against the base of Mount Franklin, just below Scenic Drive, the road that wound around the mountain and would later serve as the first scene in Manos. From the windows of our house at night, we could see the yellow, lower wattage lights across the border and the much brighter lights of El Paso on the near side, dissected by the dark ribbon of the river. The family who had lived in our house in 1919 had watched the Battle of Juarez from the front porch. I loved to sit there and imagine what it must have been like watching live theater from the comfort of home. I started out in July 1959 in Fort Worth, when my parents, Tom Neyman and the former Jackie Lumpkin, were both graduate students at Texas Christian University. My mom studying education, and my dad studying ministry. Go Horned Frogs! We lived in a big old 2-story house on a corner with 2 dogs, Shanka the Doberman and Ricky the Dachshund. with an attitude. My earliest memories in Fort Worth were when I was 3, of my friend, a trapdoor spider who lived in the front yard. I'd visit him every day by lying on my belly and enticing him with small earthly vibrations so he'd grace me with a look from his multi-eyed face. My mother used to say I was so observant that in the same year I found her contact lens in the yard after it had been lost for several weeks. That was only the beginning of my observant ways. I remember Mom taking me to the university when I was 4 for an intelligence test, and me wondering why there were people watching from behind the two-way glass and how they could possibly think I didn't know they were there. I often suspected I experienced reality different from many around me, so I embarked on a public life of trying to fit in. Mom was a fiercely independent woman who bragged to her friends that the day she brought me home from the hospital after giving birth, she left me with my dad to go to the university library to study. Dad chose El Paso as the place to move with his family in early 1964 because of the opportunity he saw there and his love for the Mexican people and their culture. He had also become strongly disillusioned by the Christian faith and questioned his plan of becoming a lifetime minister. He had grown up amongst migrant farm workers and decided to do something to help improve their lives through social work. He found work as the director of the South El Paso Boys Club and bought a home we could afford in a poor neighborhood. Although he thought the career change was a good idea, my mom had planned to be a minister's wife, mainly because the opportunities for women themselves to be ministers was not on the table in the late 50s when they married, and that would have been her ultimate dream. Mom embraced El Paso, but she did not embrace Dad's exodus from the church, which became a source of quiet contention between them. My mother became a teacher at the elementary school at Fort Bliss, got busy working on the house, and we all became El Pasoans. El Paso in the mid-60s was a city of solid economic growth. Fort Bliss continued to expand from a former frontier post into a major military base, attracting soldiers, their dependents, and military retirees. Copper smelting and oil refineries boosted the economy, while the influx of low-wage industries like clothing sweatshops on both sides of the border drew thousands of Mexican and Mexican-American immigrants. On the other end of the economic spectrum, El Paso was also a magnet for scientific research. In 1945, at the end of World War II, more than 1,500 German scientists and engineers were brought to the U.S. for employment and to prevent both the Soviet Union and Germany from accessing their expertise. To get around President Truman's anti-Nazi orders to prevent former Axis officers from working for the federal government, the Office of Strategic Services had their Nazi affiliation expunged from public records and created false biographies for the scientists, allowing the government to hire them and profit from their knowledge. 104 German rocket scientists, including Werner von Braun, the father of rocket science, worked at Fort Bliss at El Paso, some of them eventually bringing their families to settle in the area. And a side note, the El Paso Waters area was also the birthplace of the margarita, first mixed on July 4th, 1945 at Tommy's Place Bar by Francisco Pancho Morales. Perhaps von Braun and some of those other rocket scientists indulged in a margarita or two at Tommy's in their off hours. The scientists did much of their work blowing things up at White Sands Proving Ground, also known as White Sands Missile Range, which my parents thought was a cool place to go for picnics. We would drive out there to miles and miles of nothing but white sand dunes, not a shrub in sight. We would take a sled or some cardboard to skim down the dunes and then trudge back up and do it again. The three of us, four after my sister Julie came along in 1967, would vie for shade from the back lifted window of our Bronco Jeep while eating our picnic off the tailgate. Bologna and mayonnaise sandwiches on Wonder Bread with a side of Fritos and some apples. We'd have a couple thermoses of Texas sweet tea and water to combat the dehydration from the heat and relentless sunshine. No sunscreen either, not for us. Remember the copper tone suntan lotion ads of the times? No worries about skin cancer then. After lunch, I would put my sister on the front of the sled and slide down a few hills until she got too tired or got sand in her eyes and began crying. Then we would stand around looking at nothing for a while, shake the sand out of everything we could, climb back in the Jeep and head out. Dad liked to scare the crap out of us. Books. Dad liked to scare the crap out of us by flying the Jeep over the dunes, making us bounce up and bump our heads on the inside roof of the car. We didn't use seat belts or kid car seats in the late 60s, so I would hold on to my sister since I was older and had better balance. We lived. Although nostalgia tells me I should be happy for the family memories, I recall always having a vision that a picnic should involve a grassy hill, a lone oak tree, and a couple of black and white cows gazing peaceably nearby, instead of the blasted wasteland that was the backdrop for our family picnics. My favorite TV show back then was Flipper, about a dolphin and boys in Florida who got to swim all the time. I loved the sand, but I wanted water to go with it, or at least some shade. I'm going to stop here for a moment and do this in 2 videos because I'm not quite sure how it's going to download and play. Thank you so much for going along on this trip with me. It's quite the learning curve. And you're probably wondering, this is a different dress than the last one. And yes, I made this one too. See you shortly.